Hello and welcome to the Holyrood Sources podcast, where we take you inside Scottish politics. I'm Calum Macdonald, and also on the podcast, Geoff Aberdein, who was Chief of Staff to the First Minister Alex Salmond. Hello, Geoff.
Good morning.
And also here, Andy Maciver, who was Director of Communications for the Scottish Conservatives. Hello, Andy.
Hello.
Great to have you both here. Right, on the podcast today, we are previewing today's budget. We're recording on the morning of Wednesday, the 4th of December, and I hope that you are listening to this before the Finance Secretary delivers the budget on Wednesday afternoon. The podcast was certainly available before that. We'll also, though, be back on Thursday to then analyse exactly what Shona Robson announces and to explain exactly what it means. You can watch all of this, by the way, on YouTube. Search for Holyrood Sources, where we upload clips, but also the full episodes for you to enjoy, assuming we've all done our hair nicely. So just head to YouTube, subscribe to our channel there, you'll get all of our videos and updates. And you too can comment on Andy's home decor in the style of Stewarty Boy on YouTube, who on a recent video commented, "Is that actually Andy's lounge? It's like the waiting room in a house of ill repute."
Well, Stewarty Boy, how do you know what the waiting room looks like in a house of ill repute, is all I would ask you, son.
Yeah,
Stewarty Boy's been on a few stag do's, I think.
And also then, actually, our YouTube channel might become quite a good source if, for example, you are a student or a pupil in school doing modern studies. You too can access information provided by Andy and Geoff, which I believe, Geoff, you're being sort of hired out for modern studies advice at the moment, aren't you?
I went up to my nephews in Bankery on Monday night, and he's chosen to do his report, for want of a better word, on the merits or not of independence, devolution max, or just the status quo. And I thought, look, I'll get it done in an hour with him, and he'll be very clever. So 3.5 hours later, I'm struggling to come up with blooming arguments, and I'm going, this isn't good, really. And I think he'd really had held his uncle in high esteem. Not anymore. I think.
When's his reset?
I know. Yeah, exactly. I know if he doesn't pass that, can you imagine? So I was actually going to put a phone call to his teacher and say, "Come on, make sure he gets a good mark," because that's hugely embarrassing for me.
You can't lobby the teacher for a good mark. That's outrageous. Oh dear. Anyway, go and enjoy.
Good luck, James Aberdein. Good luck.
Oh, good luck, James. All the best. I loved modern studies, when I did modern studies in school, which I appreciate was quite a long time ago now.
You shock me. I didn't think you'd be a modern studies fan at all, Calum.
Yeah. Can I tell you a funny story? Actually, I knew I was going to be an objectionable individual in politics at some point, because when I was doing my standard grades in modern studies, a great teacher, my best teacher, Mr. Reid. And we were doing a mock exam on GP fund holding. Now, GP fund holding didn't actually take place in Scotland. It was only in England and Wales. And so I refused to answer the question on the basis that this question has no relevance to Scotland at all, or our health system. And actually, Mr. Reid wrote, and I always remember, he says, I actually tend to agree with you on the criticisms of our curriculum, but you're still getting a D.
Nice. Did that then just become your job application for work at the SNP? You just send them that.
Past vetting, flying colours.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. Oh dear. Right, you can get in touch with us on all we're talking about and anything you want us to talk about as well. The WhatsApp number is 0333 404 6507, or you can email hello@holyroodsources.com, or you can comment, you can reply to us on X, you can post comments on our YouTube videos, all of that. A different Geoff actually WhatsApped us after last week's episode, saying, "I appreciated this episode with Martin Green of Reform UK. I'm not entirely sure what I think of Andy pushing Martin to go big on a policy to scrap devolution. Sure, 20% want to scrap devolution, but I don't think all 20% will care enough about scrapping devolution to all turn out for reform on that one issue," which I thought was a fair point, Andy.
Yeah, it is a fair point. I mean, this is not an exact science. I think the point I was trying to make to him is that he needs to probably try to find some sort of differentiation from the Tories, because otherwise it's really pretty similar. Maybe being similar is enough. Maybe people are sick enough of the Tories that they'll just have a go for reform anyway. But I still think they need a bit of differentiation. They'll have a little bit over net zero because they'll be more scrappy on net zero. I mean, I could have found a better adjective, but you know what I'm saying. But I thought and think they probably need to find some differentiation on what is a decent-sized issue. 20% is a lot of people.
Yeah, I actually think Geoff's spot on here. I didn't agree with you last week when you said that, Andy. And the evidence is in the by-election results already. They don't have this huge differentiation, and they're starting to make inroads. I think he's absolutely spot on. And perhaps Geoff should actually come on the podcast, and it could be Calum and the two Geoffs, and we could relegate Andy.
I could not handle that. Two Geoffs. One Geoff is more than enough. Anyway, thank you, Geoff, for your WhatsApp. You can email as well, hello@holyroodsources.com. We'd love to hear from you, and especially if you can drop us a voice note on WhatsApp to include. We'll use that on the next episode. So if you're listening to this today, pay attention then to what Shona Robson announces in the budget and send us your reaction as well. Do you like what you're hearing? Do you not like what you're hearing? You can get in touch with us on WhatsApp. The number is 0333 404 6507. Right, before we get to our budget preview, just want to talk about the memorial for Alex Salmond last weekend, where, among others, the former Prime Minister Gordon Brown, the Scottish First Minister John Swinney, were among a hugely recognisable cast list, really, of people who gathered at St Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh for the public memorial service for Alex Salmond after his death in October at the age of 69. And I think, Geoff, that is actually the first thing I want to say, is the range of people who were there to mark the passing of a hugely influential politician in Scotland.
Yeah, that's right. And it was across all kind of different sections of society. So there was politicians across a range of different political parties. You mentioned Gordon Brown. I thought that was a class act that he showed up to pay his respects. But also, you know, from the business community, from the third sector as well, and also a lot of individuals and families as well from Banffin-Buchan, from the northeast, where Alex served for a long time. And I thought it was really, really nice that, if you remember, for those listeners that remember me talking about the Sapphire, the tragedy of the boat going down off the coast of Peterhead, and 4 people tragically died. Some of the families of those people were there as well, because Alec led the campaign to get the Sapphire raised. So yeah, it was a lovely tribute. If I may, just Calum, I don't want to dwell on this at all. It's not about us at all. It's about one individual. But shortly after Alec died, the family. Alex's family asked a few individuals to volunteer to organise it. I was one of those people, and the rest of them did not want to be mentioned, but I did go on to Twitter and paid a little bit of tribute to them for organising it, because I tell you guys, I had no idea. You know, you have to deal with Police Scotland, different security aspects. There is the council, there's the St Giles Cathedral securing the venue, there's creating an order of service, there's getting the performers there, proclaimers, Douglas MacLean, Alistair Fraser, Sheena Wellington. There's getting the guests there and agreed, and the invites out and all the sorts. So it was a huge effort in a little over 4 weeks. So I'm really grateful to the team for doing that.
Yeah, here. It was quite something, Andy. And I suppose it's one of those situations where we talked previously about the kind of lack of protocol, and that's fine. And that's an issue to be considered going forward from here. But it is also it's an unfamiliar thing for society in general, I was thinking, to go through something like this. And, you know, some people really disagree with Alex Salmond. Some people have mixed feelings on his passing. But he was a significant figure, and it's a kind of shared societal experience, without wishing to sound trite about it. It's one of those things where everybody has to kind of contend with how they feel about it.
Yeah, I mean, look, it wasn't an easy one because of what's happened principally over the last few years. But as I said before, I think that this is really about the office more than it is about the person. You can think what you want about Alex Salmond. He was the First Minister of Scotland. Yeah. It doesn't even matter that he was a good First Minister. It wouldn't have mattered if he was a terrible First Minister. He was the First Minister. And I think that we have to, as a nation, have respect for the office. You know, I mentioned the story about Richard Nixon. You know, Bill Clinton did the eulogy at Nixon's funeral. Every single former president and First Lady was there when Nixon's body was flown in. Nobody had any respect for Nixon. Nobody liked Nixon, but they respected the office. And, I think that's what we have to do here. I was pleased about Saturday. I think, firstly, I'm, proud of Geoff for the job that he did on Saturday. But most of all, I was pleased that it reflected an awful lot better on the nation than the previous situation had when Alex Salmond's body arrived back in Scotland. So, I think it was a much more appropriate day on Saturday in terms of Scotland sending off a former First Minister.
Just to mention as well, and again, it shouldn't necessarily become about this, but there were lots of people gathered outside on the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, and John Swinney was booed and called a traitor. There were also shouts of "shame on you" directed at him as he arrived. Geoff, I wondered if you wanted to just reflect and react to that.
Yeah, to be fair, to my mind, there's at least a couple of thousand lining the streets, opposite the Parliament Square, as it's called, or outside St Giles, and the vast majority of them were there to pay their respects and pay their tribute to Tallaght. There was a small minority that chose to boo John Swinney, and as you say, one or two that shouted those things. To me, that's really unfortunate. It was a service of remembrance, and I think, in my own views, that's totally inappropriate. But also, I thought that by shouting that, now I get that emotions are running high, but you're taking away from presumably what they were coming to do, is pay their respects, and it immediately made it about them and what they said, as opposed to, as I say, paying tribute to a man and a former First Minister. And I just thought that was counterproductive and didn't reflect well on them at all. So I'm afraid that was unfortunate, but I think it's important to stress it was just a very small minority.
Yeah, fair point. And it was a remarkable day. The lineup of guests, the people that were there, the respect that was shown was really quite something. So absolutely well done to all involved. And something I'm sure we can continue to reflect on. On a slightly separate but related note, Angus MacNeil has joined the Alba party and may stand as a candidate for the party at the next Holyrood election. He's the former MP for Nahilin and Ear. He was suspended, then expelled from the SNP last year. Angus MacNeil, something of a defection, I suppose, although it's fair to say that in the last few years he's been pretty critical of the SNP. I wonder what you make of Angus MacNeil's move.
The first thing I make of it is that our YouTube viewers will realise that not only is this breaking news, but it's also new news to Geoff, who just about jumped out of his seat and started looking at his phone when you said that.
It's in the Herald.
So, breaking news for Geoff Aberdein on Holyrood Sources podcast. Look, I think that given where he is, that's going to be an exceptionally tricky seat. It would be it's a very tricky seat for Alistair Allen, frankly, the sitting SNP MSP, given that Torquil Crichton took it for Labour at the general election. So it's going to be even trickier for Angus MacNeil. Of course, I'm sure if he stands, he'll be looking more for a list seat than he will for the constituency. And, I don't think you can rule any of that out. There is space for another pro-independence political party. I've always had my doubts, from the moment Alex Salmond formed it, I've always had my doubts that there's space for this pro-independence party. But there is space for a pro-independence party. Funny things are going to happen in this 2026 election. We talked about reform, and, there's no reason why, if the stars align, there might be some space for a seat or two for the Alba party. I'm not convinced. I would probably bet against it, but you never know.
Geoff, I'm sorry to break the news to you out loud. Angus MacNeil then has joined Alba. He has been pretty dissatisfied with the SNP, particularly on independence. So I suppose that's probably what's fueling him, really.
Yeah, I suppose I wasn't aware, as I think we've just confirmed.
Do you want me to read some quotes to you? Shall I read some quotes to you? He says there are a lot of good people in the SNP. Yeah, there are a lot of good people in the SNP, but they can't achieve anything on independence when the clueless and disinterested hierarchy has thwarted debate for years, and I certainly know about that. Even now, independence is not in the motions for the upcoming National Council meeting. It is 6 years since the SNP hierarchy proclaimed it didn't need a plan B and then when the plan A ran out, they hadn't a clue what to do. Asked if he would stand as a candidate for Alba in 2026, says, that's up for the membership, but I might put myself forward if there were indications that people wanted me to do that. If it helps to kickstart independence, I would do. This is him speaking to the Herald.
Yeah, and I think, as Andy said, it's perhaps not as surprising as you might think, because he has been pretty critical of the SNP. I also think what Andy said about this next election could be a very strange election. I'm thinking back to the early parliaments when we had, the socialists and we had independents in the chamber. Is it going to materialise into quite a hodgepodge of those different parties and people seeking coalitions across various different parties? It'll be interesting to see if that materialises. But I do think how Alba kind of go forward in the wake of Alex Salmond's death is going to be most interesting. They haven't made significant impact yet at the ballot box, although there has been some signs, in fairness, in local by-elections that they may be a route to returning that kind of 5-6% you need to get in on the list. And that's what I suspect Angus MacNeil would do. I don't think he'll stand on the constituency seat. I think he'll simply stand on the list and see if he can sneak in that way in the Highlands and Islands. But we'll wait and see. An interesting development nonetheless.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Geoff. Appreciate that, having landed it on you. Right, this is the Holyrood Sources podcast. Our budget preview comes next. Thanks for being with us on the Holyrood Sources podcast. Right, we had a little bit of a tease ahead to the budget with Mary Spowage of the Fraser of Islander Institute on last week's episode. A couple of you reacted to that. Murdo said, listening to this week's podcast in sunny Aberdein, Ivory Coast? Absolutely 100% with Mary Spowage, Geoff and Andy's fury about the Scotland money. I tried to get Angus MacNeil interested in it, but he just couldn't be bothered, suggests Murdo. Alistair Allen paid lip service, of course the current MSP. At least £16 million of Scotland money left Hebridean and Wassers, and very little came back. The lack of outrage and anger is just beyond me. It's one of many reasons why I resigned my membership of the SNP 2 weeks ago. I don't recognise who this party is anymore, says Murdo. Which I thought was interesting to note, by way of setting up our conversation. And also, we've been asking on Twitter this morning what you want to hear and what you don't want to hear in the budget today. Gordon says, I don't want to hear blame. For example, a tight fiscal situation imposed on Scotland by Westminster and Labour. It is partly not true, suggests Gordon, and partly tired. I wish the SNP would get back to the best of the Salmond years, taking responsibility and aspiring to be something great. So a couple of your messages just to tee up our conversation. So there is a suggestion from our friends at the Fraser of Islander Institute that the Finance Secretary, Shona Robson, will have little room for manoeuvre when she steps up at Holyrood this afternoon. They're warning that rising public sector wages and other spending pressures mean ministers may have as little as £100 million to play with on new policies. Shona Robson says she will put more money in people's pockets with the budget. And Andy, the Scottish Government tweeted yesterday, the budget prioritises investing in Scotland's NHS, putting more money into people's pockets, creating jobs and economic growth. These sound like admirable priorities, don't they?
Yeah. They also sound like priorities that I could have heard in any budget for the last 25 years, to be honest with you. I think this is a very, very important moment for the SNP government, actually. I think this is going to set the tone for the next 18 months. They've been here, the Swinney Forbes government has been in for just over 6 months. They're 25% of the way through what is essentially a 2-year job, at least at the start, a 2-year job. And I think that there is a calming, and I think that there is a general sense that things will move in the right direction. But I chose my word "will move in the right direction" carefully because I don't think there's that much evidence that things have moved in the right direction yet. I think it's mainly a perception at the moment rather than an action. And that's why I think this is a really important budget for them, because I think this is a budget that will tell us whether this is a government that's actually different from its predecessors or whether it's basically just the same in a new wrapper. I wasn't encouraged by that tweet yesterday, to be honest with you. talk about Einstein's definition of insanity. Well, pouring more money into the NHS without doing anything to it is the very definition of that. From business to trade unions and the Auditor General in between, everybody's now saying the same thing. Stop throwing money at this without reforming it. It's not going to do any good. It's just a waste of valuable cash that we could be spending on something else. So, let's see what it says today, but on the basis of that top line of their tweet yesterday of investing in the NHS, I'm not convinced yet that this is much different to what we've seen in the past.
Yeah. Geoff, the Conservatives saying that the SNP, quote, have failed Scotland by making people pay more while getting less, by continually raising income tax while NHS and education standards decline. Do they have to do something in the budget today to try to shake that perception, paying more, getting less?
Yes, I'm going to come back to that
sure.
In a second, if you don't mind. But I was just interested in, I can't remember the caller's name who talked about, I don't want to hear the Scottish Government saying...
Gordon,
Gordon saying, that don't want the Scottish Government to say that we've got this imposed on Westminster with a tight fiscal regime and all the rest of it. I'm afraid that is going to happen, Gordon. You're going to be disappointed. But I want to say that actually I think there's some legitimacy in that. But I think it's about how you articulate it more than anything else, because I do accept the premise of what he's saying, that kind of frustration. And I just think one thing we don't talk a lot enough about as ministers is just reminding people that the UK government controls over 70% of revenue in Scotland and 40% of the expenditure. That is a fact. Right? That is the devolution settlement as things stand. And so I think the way that Scottish ministers have to remind people and educate and inform people about that is, look, we do not have control over all the economic levers here. And that by definition means that we are at times playing catch up. We're working within a set of rules. And I think that is important context for any budget statement, because that is the very nature of how devolution works. So I do accept Gordon's premise, but he is going to be disappointed, I would say. Now, on your question, look, I think Andy's right. This is John Swinney's big opportunity to set out his stall in terms of what he wants his government to look like, feel like, operate like. And John was Finance Secretary for the entirety of my time in office. He knows this brief really well. He knows how this works. I expect to see a bit more focus on the economy, growing the economy. Why? Because we all want to see that, and we all need to see it if we're going to increase our tax take. But secondly, because the Labour Party in government in Westminster have made economic growth their big thing, and I'm afraid to say, given the national insurance contributions, Ferrari perhaps are not going to achieve it, at least in the perception of the voters, in the next 12 months. There's a political opportunity to create distance there. We are the party that's looking after the Scottish economy. Now, will that be successful? We'll know in about 5 hours, but I do expect to see some measures that really point to growth in the economy around energy. Perhaps we might see something on business rates. I don't think they're going to be able to go as far as they want to, but are we going to see something on non-domestic rates? These sorts of things, I think, what I would look out for anyone listening in.
Yeah. A couple of things on the NHS. This is from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Healthcare is the Scottish Government's largest area of spending. They say, they say the NHS recovery, health and social care budget is planned to be £20.6 billion this year, which is around 1/3 of the total Scottish Government budget and close to half of day-to-day spending on public services. Just as a quick thought on the NHS, Andy, it strikes me that it is something that people interact with. It is a great way for a government to demonstrate something is changing and that they are in command of a progress, basically. It's these sort of frontline things that make a real difference. Budgets can often feel obscure, ambiguous and distant, but because of interaction with the NHS, it is somewhere where progress would be evident to people.
Progress would be evident to people, but there's no... it's not going to make any progress. I mean, we know that putting money into the NHS doesn't make it any better. So there's not going to be any progress here. The Auditor General said this morning that the Scottish Government's plan is a rehash of a plan from 2020, which they don't think can be delivered. So there's no sign that there's any difference here in the NHS. There's no sign there's any other reforms that are required to actually make the NHS work. This, to me, just looks like a platitude, to be honest, and something that all governments say at all budgets, which is we're going to invest in the NHS because we know how precious it is and all of that. And I think people are ahead of politicians on this now, to be honest with you. You can see it in polling all the time. People don't believe it anymore, and it's not about John Swinney or the SNP. People don't believe any political party that says they're going to put more money in and that's going to fix the NHS. The public are ahead of politicians on this game now, so I just don't think it's going to do any good. And my concern is that it makes it says to me, do they have other ideas, or is this really just continuity? And I think that's what I would like to see this afternoon. I think that's what a lot of people would like to see this afternoon, is the SNP taking the chance to actually make this, which it could be, by the way, quite a revolutionary budget that does real things and takes real action in the areas that we know action needs taken. Not necessarily on the NHS,
sure.
but on other things.
Well, let's go through. Go on.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to come back on Andy's point. I mean, for those listeners that know that we had a special of our podcast last week, will be broadcast in the Christmas break on long-term savings and that huge crisis that we face. We talked a lot about short-termism, and that's where the NHS falls into this bracket, because the problem that ministers have right now is if they don't give more frontline expenditure to the NHS, it is easy fodder for your opposition to say you're not backing our NHS. And sadly, we get into this cyclical arrangement whereby that is the definition of whether you're supporting the NHS. And people are unafraid, I believe, to look at longer term solutions because by definition the results will be longer term. And that's a real shame about our NHS. So I accept Andy's frustrations, but I think he probably will be disappointed today as well.
Good. Everyone's going to face a bit of disappointment.
Joyous start of the day.
And Geoff mentions a special that we recorded last week, which you will hear over Christmas, looking at kind of demographics, Scotland's ageing population, the problems that presents when it comes to funding that, basically, and sustaining it. So listen out for that over at Christmas time. Right, a few of the front pages on this. The front page of the Times in Scotland: scrap peak rail fares, bosses urge. Businesses across Scotland are lobbying ministers to ease the financial strain on workers by scrapping peak rail fares that have doubled the cost for commuters. So this feeds into the how will businesses feel about this budget. The Scotsman, in its steamy newsletter this morning, suggests it's a tricky one to consider whether businesses will be listened to overall, because in recent years, businesses in Scotland haven't exactly been thrilled by the Scottish budget. Andy, what would be a demonstration by the Scottish Government that they are listening to businesses, they are responding to what businesses need?
Tax cuts.
Right.
I mean, that is what it is. If you go to any business, small or large, anywhere in the country, and you say to them, what's holding you back? Well, some of them will have issues like the planning system and various things like that. But we are having massive difficulty in this country attracting workers from elsewhere, for sure. And we have significant difficulties with the fact that taxes are higher in Scotland than they are in England if you earn over £28,000, which a lot of people wouldn't consider to be a lot of money. So, if you say to business, what are you looking for? Well, they want that gap reduced for sure. And some of it's a hard political argument because you're talking about some people at the upper levels of earning, but the truth is that we need to broaden our tax base. We need higher earners. And it's not just, the fat cat bankers like trade unions like to talk about. We're talking here about the NHS can't attract consultant doctors because, frankly, they'll go and work in Newcastle for the same salary and for much less tax. So, we're punishing ourselves here. We are killing ourselves in this country through so-called progressive taxation. And if there's one thing businesses will want, they'll want tax cuts.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is going to be fascinating. Are the Scottish Government going to accept the argument that the raises in income tax, for example, have not had the dividends that they wanted, as the IFS have pointed out, and as we mentioned with Mary Spowich on last week's podcast. Is this a signal that Scottish Government are recognising that they've got this wrong and are going to try and lower the personal tax base, personal taxation of our population? Interesting to see if anything is done on that, and I think that's one to look out again for our listeners. If they do, that might be the herald, the kind of Swinney and Forbes approach to things. And my guess is they won't be able to change things fully from where they are just now. But do they try to lower the income tax, or at least stop the increases? We'll wait and see. But that'll be an interesting thing to look out for.
So on that, it was this time last year that there was the introduction of a new income tax band. There's not been an awful lot of talk about income taxes this time. The Scotsman points out that we should keep an eye on whether income tax bands will be frozen, because, of course, if they are, then you'll then be dragged into higher tax bands as your pay goes up. And right now, the stat to remember is that around 1.5 million people in Scotland with a salary over £28,850 already pay more in income tax than if they lived in England. The top rate is 48p, which is 3p more than south of the border as well. Geoff, can I ask actually, just on the kind of on that, because income tax is such a political one as well. How much will the SNP, to what extent will the SNP Scottish Government today and in this budget process be thinking that they've got another budget to do, and that one will be a few months before a Holyrood election this time next year? So how much do they hold back to create waves in a year's time?
Yeah, and it depends how much manoeuvrability you've got, and what package you've got to try and do that. But you've just made a really good point. There are two budgets before the next election. So, one's today. So does this set in motion politically the identity of Swinney and Forbes and their approach to these things, setting up for another move in that direction before the election? I think that is going to be really interesting to see. So if there is movement on income tax today, you can bet your bottom dollar there will be further movement later on next in the following budget as well. So that is definitely something I think we should be looking out for today. But will it happen? Well, listen, there's only a few people that know that. But to my mind, it would be very wise for them to do. Again, you want to create that distance with what's gone before, but also try and kind of suggest to the voters that we've got your back here. That government down there, they've only been in 150 days and they're not looking after our potential growth. We are.
Couple of other front pages, just by way of, I suppose, the economic context for Scotland as well. The P&J this morning, energy hub to speed up wind farms investment. A new wind energy centre is a new wind energy centre is to be created in Aberdein, of all places, to help speed up offshore projects and drive investment, revealed on the front of the P&J today. They understand the hub would bring various bodies together. Industry figures complain the planning system is too complex, and so hope a focus in Aberdein will streamline the process and unlock the North East's renewable energy potential. Geoff, I feel like you should respond to this, because energy has to be part of the budget, doesn't it, in some way, shape or form? And this is an interesting bit of just sort of context on budget day.
Yeah, energy has to be a focus of this budget. Has to be, for obvious reasons. I'm not sure if this is going to be in the budget or not, though. I don't know. It wasn't clear reading the item that this is a budget announcement. I'm not necessarily sure it is. I don't know. We'll wait to see. But nonetheless, it's very positive. Look, one of the big issues is, right, we're asking people, companies, to invest in the transition, invest in renewables. The best way to do that, as Scotland's concerned, is this massive offshore wind potential that we have. But the big stumbling block is, getting planning and consent for these projects is just simply not quick enough. So I guess the idea here is putting the relevant officials that are responsible for this across the different agencies in one place, in one hub. And of course, being in Aberdein would make perfect sense, because you're next to the largest concentration of supply chain companies anywhere in the UK as far as energy is concerned, and indeed in close proximity to a lot of projects. That is the energy hub. You're next to GB Energy as well. So can you get this accelerated, and then these projects accelerated, get them consented, get them on stream, and then get them the investment? I'm assuming GB Energy would have a role there as well, to move things quickly. Now, you mentioned, or the piece mentions, this is great for the North East's energy transition. No, let's be clear, this is great for Scotland and the UK's energy transition if this materialises, because this is a massive issue. So very welcome signs, but let's see if it's confirmed either today or later on in the week.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, it is, and we know that planning is an absolutely massive issue. It's too expensive. It takes a ridiculously long time to get anything through in this country, and that needs change. This is, though, where I think budgets are interesting in terms of short-term work and long-term work. So we talked earlier on about, the NHS is a long-term project, and in the short term, sometimes you just have to say you're going to put money into it so you don't get criticised by your opponents. And Geoff is right to say that. That's unfortunately the reality of government in this country, is that sometimes you have to say and do things that are stupid, because otherwise you get criticised for it. But budgets are also about the long term. They are about the long term as well. And energy is probably going to be the economic backbone of the country for hundreds of years to come, renewable energy in particular. And the truth is that, what was in the P&J today was good news, but it's nothing like enough. I mean, we need to take a reality check here about how unprepared we actually are for the energy revolution that we want. We don't have the infrastructure in place, we don't have the housing in place, we don't have the people in the right place. We've talked about depopulation. The people are not in the right place for this revolution. And some of this is very long term. We've talked about the A9 as though it is the final piece of the infrastructure puzzle. I mean, come on, guys. There was news on the A96 last week that it's not going to be dual. The A96 goes from Aberdein to Inverness, two really important renewable energy hubs, and it is a dreadful, dreadful road. There's massive pump storage hydro sites going in the West Highlands, and you can't get two trucks past each other in the A82 and the A83. Our road infrastructure, our housing infrastructure is absolutely woeful in the parts where it needs to be good for the renewable energy revolution to actually take place. Those are long-term issues, and you can't wait until a pre-election budget 6 months before to chuck something in on that. You can't build a new road in 6 months. These are long-term things, and there's absolutely incentive for the SNP government to say, right, we are now going to create the conditions for this to happen. And frankly, if you're looking at it politically, in 18 months' time, they're not going to have delivered any of it anyway, but they could at least put in place a framework to say, here is the infrastructure revolution that we are putting in place so that we can realise these renewables ambitions, because at the moment we're nowhere on that.
Yeah, and I tell you, just on that very, very point, I mean, I was very vocal last week about the A96. Look, I get the A9 is totemic because of life endangerment of that road, and there's some arguments on that on the A96 as well, but a strategic economic imperative really should be the A96 for the reasons that Andy's outlined. And going back to where we were earlier in this podcast about the ScotWind money, wouldn't that be a great way to invest some of the ScotWind money? Because it's clear, not just does that would that help the communities in which it immediately serves, it would help speed up travel between two locations and the routes on the way and the ports on the way that are absolutely imperative to the green industrialisation of our country.
One other thing I want to mention in passing is winter fuel payments, because last week the Social Justice Secretary, Shirley Ann Somerville, announced this new universal winter heating payment for all pensioners in Scotland, but we didn't have much detail on where the cash for that's coming from, and we were told to sit and wait for the budget, so that's something else to keep an eye on. Just a couple of other front pages. The Scotsman business plea amid Robertson budget pledge. So businesses say their resilience is at breaking point, says the front page of the Scotsman. And this one, Andy, this is the Daily Record. £200 million on the house is the headline. John Swinney will reverse Humza Yousaf's brutal cut to homes funding with a major reset in today's budget. The Record's campaigned for this, they say, and so they're quite excited about it. Are you as excited?
Well, housing is quite exciting, actually, in a funny kind of way. I think let's wait for the detail on that one. I think it's a really important area, and I think it's, we talked about short-term and long-term issues. I think housing is a good short-term and a good long-term issue, to be quite honest with you. the housing problem in Scotland is not actually all that complicated. The housing problem in Scotland is that there's not enough supply and there's too much demand. It's just a failure of demand and supply across all the sectors, across the owned sector, across the private rented sector, across housing associations, council housing, all the same. Not enough supply, too much demand. The supply issues caused by lots of things, including the planning system that we discussed earlier on. And also caused by the lack of investment, which has actually been going down because of the Scottish Government's own policy, because institutional investors have not been investing in Scotland because they have not seen it as an environment where they can get sufficient return because of the rent cap. So there's a lot to be done on housing. I think the Scottish Government knows what the problem is in housing. I think the big question is, do they have the right solution to that problem to make sure that we get more building happening and more supply coming in? So good that he's talking about it, encouraging, I think, but let's see where that money's going, what it's going into, and what sectors he is looking at.
Just a couple of minutes left then of our preview. So, Geoff, let's turn to the politics, because there is something a little unusual about the budget today. It's not obvious who the SNP are going to get support from by way of other parties. John Swinney is 3 MSPs short of a majority, so he needs some members of the opposition to get in line. The Herald says today the rumour is that he might turn to the Lib Dems. The suggestion is, in fact, that they've already agreed some sort of deal. And on the other end of this, Labour saying it would rather fight an early election than vote for a bad budget and subject Scottish people to another year of SNP misery. Do you believe them?
No.
I mean, Labour are clearly confident this budget's going through, because there is no way they'd want to be the ones to be seen to be calling election. The population does not take kindly to folk in this context. Urging an early election, and it's easy response for John Swinney saying, okay, so you're not going to let me help the NHS then that I've outlined today. You're not going to help me help the housing sector as I outlined today, or as Shona Robson outlined today, and so on and so forth. And I've been there before, incidentally, back in 2009, and Labour kind of, shall we say, reneged very quickly on their pledge to a vote against the budget and sat in their hands because they knew they didn't want election. So I think we are seeing the bones of an agreement. Will that be clear today is a different question, because there's 3 stages to this budget process, which will go on into February. So it's not necessarily going to be apparent today. It might be, but we'll wait and see. So I think this budget will go through. And we've discussed it a lot in previous podcasts that I don't see the imperative of any political party to call an election just now. I don't think it suits anyone. There's too much uncertainty. So I think this will go through. I think the Liberals are probably the best shout, but we will wait.
I think, Labour might have wanted an election a few months ago, but things have not exactly gone their way over the last few months. Labour definitely don't want an election now. And if Labour honestly do want an election, then they need their heads examined, because it's not a good time for them to have one. I said earlier on this was an important budget, I think, for the SNP. I think in some ways it's also an important budget for our politics in general. And it's for that reason that I would actually actively quite like to see this budget being a combination of the SNP and the Lib Dems, because I think that will tell a story about how we are able to move on from constitutional politics. I think that's really important for the country that we do on issues like the NHS, where actually you need an element of cross-party support to do the things that need to be done to the NHS. We need to be able to move past this tribal constitutionalism. And if we have a budget that's passed by the Lib Dems, an SNP budget passed by the Lib Dems, that will send a really strong signal, I think, to the country that we're able to grow up a little bit and move on beyond this sort of thing. So I would like to see, frankly, the Lib Dems support it. I'd like to see the Greens oppose it, because I think that's a good signal of change as well. And I think it will tell us a lot as we go into the next 18 months if we can get that sort of maturity where we have a nationalist party and a unionist party coming together, supporting a budget that they think is in the best interests of the country. We might not all agree with every bit of it, but I think that element alone would be worth a small celebration in the corner if we can get that achieved, because it's maybe just the end of tribal constitutional politics if we do.
And not just let me finish by saying, SNP need to stop moaning. 3 seats, three votes they need. 3. Listen, I was there when we needed 18. We had 47 seats, you know, and we managed to get it done. So just pull your socks up, guys. Back on.
And on that note, Geoff and Andy, thank you both very much indeed. That is your budget preview from the Holyrood Sources podcast. We'll be back in your feed tomorrow to see exactly what's been announced, to analyse it and to make sense of it for you. Subscribe to the podcast and make sure you join us then, and we'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you so much for watching. Press subscribe and you'll get all the best videos offering insight on Scottish politics delivered straight to your feed. Press subscribe and stick around. And if you'd like to hear our conversations in full, open up your podcast app and search for Holyrood Sources.